does C.S. Lewis mean by the Tao? It might be weird to think of C.S. Lewis as talking about the Tao or the Tao, and then asking the question, why would a Christian professor talk about something associated with a way of living or a philosophy sourced in the East from about 2,500 years ago? It is sort of a weird question until you begin to realize what C.S. Lewis is doing in his book, The Abolition of Man. It's a book that I've heard about for years, and I actually just finished it fully this morning. I'm learning and thinking through this book, and it makes a lot more sense of Lewis in terms of his fiction writing. Alongside of it, I'm reading This Hideous Strength, which is kind of the narrative version, I suppose, of The Abolition of Man. What Lewis is trying to do is understand what it actually means to be educated today in the 20th, or at his time in the 20th century. How that actually works. We talked a little bit about man without chest, people maybe who have all the facts, but none of the heart, none of the right desires to love what they ought to love and hate what they ought to hate. And then he comes into the next chapter in this book, and it's called The Way, because that's what the Tao means, the way. And he says, look, there's a couple ways to think. I mean, there's probably many ways, but he's really discussing two ways that we're looking at things. You can look at things within the way, or within the Tao, or outside the Tao. So what exactly is this thing that he's talking about? And why is he saying that people live outside the Tao, live outside the way, live outside of natural law, live outside of this way of seeing the world in which we conform ourselves to nature rather than seeing nature as something to be dominated and shaped towards our instincts and desires? Well, let me read to you just like a really, I think he has a few places where he defines it, but on page 32 of my edition of The Abolition of Man, he defines it in this way. He says that the Tao is basically, and this is I'm kind of reading, kind of jumping into a sentence, practical principles known to all men by reason are simply the Tao. So practical principles known to all men by reason are simply the Tao. So when he says the Tao, or the Tao, however you want to pronounce it, he is talking about these universally known principles, which we used to call first principles, natural law, in a sense, maybe like the older way of thinking about common sense. He says on page 43 of my edition, this thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law, or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. That's like a pretty important phrase, because for Lewis, living within the Tao is living within a world in which everything has meaning. That up is up and down is down for a reason, that the sun rises for a particular reason, that when you see something in nature, maybe a limit, for example, we say, oh, that limit must mean something for me. Maybe I'm not meant to transgress that limit. Think of today some of our technological feats, where I suspect in Toronto, in about 10 years, you'll have apartment buildings full of single or unmarried people with external womb sacs growing a fetus or fetuses for the purpose of having a child outside of the regular process of pregnancy, and usually the implication that there would be two people to caretake the child afterwards. It's one of those things where you're like, okay, well, there are natural limits, there are people who deal with these things, but is transcending that limit actually good? Are we sort of evacuating nature of its meaning? Because traditionally, I know that it's different for different people, I understand that, but traditionally, across cultures, across time, whether you're living in China, India, Canada, France, whatever, it would kind of work this way. You'd have two people for mutual, say, love and protection, or mutual society, whatever the exact motivation is, agree to sort of partner or align themselves together, and then they would have a child. Typically, a woman would be in a very sensitive and dire situation during pregnancy, before modern medicine anyways. And so the male partner, often the husband, would have to protect and provide in a very unique way, just for the sake of the preservation of the woman's life and for the progeny's life. was just kind of natural. So it formed bonds of, in the ideal world, and I know it's not always ideal, a friendship, fellowship, mutual society, co-vocation, love, support. Typically, raising a child would be through a lifelong partnership called marriage, through a marital union. And so it would create a whole like material context and spiritual context for children to grow up and to know their parents and to have moral instruction from a father and from mother, to be able to understand both the sexes, to be able to understand how this actually worked in life, that have brothers and sisters and siblings, and then these families would create society together, and this society would create a sort of political element, and that political element would create whatever the larger country or nation state is. But due to a change in how we view things today, as Lewis talks about, we live outside the Tao, and we live more or less by instinct, by desire, without reflecting on it reasonably. And even if you're using your brain, don't hear me wrong, you could be using it, but you're not saying, does my brain, does my mind, am I corresponding to the natural order of things? Am I seeing myself within the Tao, within this ongoing structure of reality that has limits in place, that has openings in place, that teaches us something? I'm reminded of an ancient book called the Proverbs, in which the writer says, go to the ant. Look to the ant, you sluggard. Understand how the ant works and acts and does things. And once you understand how the ant works in nature, you'll have a better understanding of how you should act in life. You see, you're not supposed to become an ant, but you're supposed to learn something from nature. Another ancient book called Isaiah, you have this, I can't remember if it's in the 28th chapter or so of Isaiah. You have a farmer who plants and sows and reaps. And then it says, doesn't God teach you how to do these things? You say, how does God teach you? Well, through the natural process. You plant a seed, you water it, you see it grow, you nurture it, it provides food for you. You learn through cause and effect, through the regular order of things, how to conform your life to it. You become someone invested in the ground, someone invested in the environment. Sir Roger Scruton calls a conservative someone who loves something that is near them. Something like that, just by memory. And yes, so you're planting, you're reaping, you're sowing, you love the soil around you. A true conservative conserves. I mean, conservatives are conservatives. They should love the environment, love the world around us, love the neighborhood, love people. Too often, of course, that's not true today, because many conservatives are living outside the Tao. They are looking at things as all about technological mastery, overcoming the limits that we have for ourselves, thinking about everything as economic and efficient ends. This is kind of one example of living outside the Tao. Now, C.S. Lewis is writing in 1944 during the Second World War, so I'm sure he has in mind a lot more than this. He has in mind Friedrich Nietzsche's sort of instinctual morality, where you, more or less, you do what you find your own meaning and you follow your instinctual drive for life and vitality. And in that sense, you're creating your own Tao. You're creating your own way. But by doing that, by finding your own meaning, finding your own self, finding your own morality, you are actually living outside of the Tao simply by doing that itself. This becomes really, really, I think, important in life when we get to when push comes to shove, when life becomes hard, when we have to make moral judgments about family, friends, honor, especially when war or something comes, like it did in the Second World War. How will we live? What will the choices we make be? Will we see ourselves as someone who are floating individuals who create our own way of life with no boundaries, no limits? If that happens, I don't know how we survive. We end up, as in the third chapter of this of the Abolition of Man, as C.S. Lewis talks about, we end up denaturing nature. Nature is merely a mere thing, without meaning, without purpose, without efficient cause, without final cause, just a stuff that we use. No reason, no purpose, just mere stuffiness. So it takes out of life, I think, the sort of mystery, the sort of adventure, the sort of joy, the sort of idea that there is something to discover that is and is beyond us and is for all people, for all times, in all places. And all of us, although we have different language to express it, different contexts in which we apply it, different laws that correspond to it, live by something called first principles, natural law, the Tao, whatever you want to call it. There is something consistent in the world that is universally discernible by reason if we have eyes to see and reflect on what is.